All right, well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody for being here today. My name is Aaron Clems. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, and we're celebrating our 50th year of doing work to protect Minnesota's environment and the health of its people through our work at the legislature, in the courts, and at regulatory agencies. And we're really excited today to have a different kind of webinar. As you know, MCEA is really focused on policy development and working in the courts. But the people that are doing this work are also people, and we have to maintain our motivation in the face of really difficult times. And I think we're really heading into one right now. And it was kind of what we wanted to do is to have a broader conversation about how to stay hopeful and cultivate the resilience we need to keep doing this work, this critical and essential work on climate to ensure that we have a livable climate for our children and grandchildren, for our people and the ecosystems that depend on a livable climate. This is, about how it feels to do the work more than it is about the work itself. And so we're really excited to have a panel today to talk about how we can help keep doing it, even when it's hard and frustrating and not moving at the pace we wanted to. I'm really grateful to the three guests that we have that have joined us, each of which is involved in climate work in their respective careers. And I'll give a brief introduction, but I'll let them also introduce themselves in a moment. First, we have Barb Fries. Barbara Fries is an attorney and author and climate policy expert who works at MCEA. She works at the Public Utilities Commission. She also literally wrote the book on coal, and we're excited to have her here because she has a long history of working on climate work throughout lots of different periods of time, both time when there's lots of progress and time when progress is frustrating. Secondly, we've got Sachiko Graber. Sachiko is a climate equity consultant who works in Minnesota. And she's going to talk a little bit about her work and how it relates to climate progress, but also how she keeps on doing it in the face of difficult times. And lastly, we have Nora Hertel. Nora is the founder of Project Optimist, which is a solutions-driven online website, which helps Minnesotans find solutions to complex problems, including climate change. And we're excited to have her perspective on journalism in a time like this. And there are links in their chat that you can see that will help you learn more about their work if you're interested in finding out more about them. And we'll of course, hear from them during this hour. We'll spend the first 40 minutes or so asking them some questions about how they stay hopeful and build resilience in their work. And then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions from the audience. So if you've got questions, please drop them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them as many of them as we can at the end of the conversation. And lastly, I just want to say that webinars from MCEA are made possible because of your support and your individual support of our work. And we want to, first of all, thank you so much for that. Consider donating today so we can finish our year well-resourced to fight for the environmental future that we all deserve in 2025. And that link will be in your chat as well. But I want to start by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work. So I'll start with, we'll just in the order we started this conversation with, and I'll start with Barb. So Barb, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you came to work on climate issues?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron, and welcome everybody. I'm really glad you're attending. I began working on climate change back in 1994, so it's 30 years now. I was an attorney then with the Minnesota Attorney General's office, and my client was the State Pollution Control Agency. And we, at that time, had state utility regulators that were holding a proceeding trying to quantify in dollars and cents the cost to the environment of generating electricity. And I know that might sound kind of boring, but it turned out to be actually very dramatic and kind of life-changing for me. Because since we get most of our electricity, both in Minnesota and in the United States from coal, or we did in 1994, we focused on coal. And we didn't just focus on air quality, we focused on climate, which was a really new thing at that time at the state level. And it struck a really sensitive nerve with the national coal industry, which intervened and brought to Minnesota a handful of their top sort of climate denial scientists to tell us that we did not have to worry about climate change, and because it wasn't going to happen, or if it did, it would be mild and we'd enjoy it and it would be fine. And my job was to cross-examine these witnesses. And this was basically my introduction to climate science, to climate denial, and to the coal industry. And it changed the trajectory of my career and my life because I've been focused on these issues ever since in one way or another. I left the AG's office a while later to write the book that Aaron mentioned about coal and its impact on human history. And after that, I consulted on climate and coal issues in the nonprofit sector as an attorney, including for MCEA, and as a policy analyst for the Union of Concerned Scientists. And as a writer, I wrote another book that was partly about climate denial. And I've been on the staff of MCEA working in their climate program now since 2021, focused still on trying to get the power sector to decarbonize as quickly as possible. So that's my background.
Thanks so much, Barbara. That's really interesting. Let's turn to Sachiko. Sachiko, can you talk a little about yourself and how you came to do climate work in Minnesota?
Yeah, thank you, Erin, and thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel. I'm just very excited about this conversation. I feel like I don't have quite as smooth of a story to share compared to Barbara. I started out kind of as a confused undergraduate. I studied physics, but was privileged to go to a liberal arts college. And so I spent a lot of time as a young person kind of grappling with how do we deal with and understand the science of what's happening in and to our world, and how do we pair that with what's actually happening to people and to our neighbors and to some of the most vulnerable people who are facing the impacts. And over time, I sort of eased my way from that harder science physics background into much more of a community and environmental justice focus. So I spent some time in the international development space. I went back to grad school and really spent some time thinking about the intersectionality that impacts climate change and its effects on us, thinking about not just what is the science, what are the solutions, how do we deploy more solar, which is super important, and also how does that look when we're sitting in a community? How does that look when you're sitting at the dinner table? How does that look and feel as we're starting to have these weird weather events everywhere in the world? And eventually I made it to the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, which is a globally focused but US-based nonprofit that they call themselves like a think and do tank. So it's research on kind of the state of the clean energy transition, and then also work to think about how do we apply that. And with RMI, I did a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at how do we create, using climate as sort of a lever, how do we create opportunities for leapfrogging when we think about access to the types of resources and services that all people deserve. And so I did a lot of work there on rural electrification, thinking about, in the US, we have this huge transmission grid that connects all of our towns and cities to one another. But is that the most effective? Do we have to build out all of that infrastructure? For example, if you're trying to serve a very remote rural village, what are the more accessible, affordable, attractive ways to bring the services that electricity provides to those communities without necessarily making those massive investments that governments honestly can't afford? And I ended up moving to Minnesota after that work. It was really interesting. It was real. Like, you would go out and you would interview people in the village and try to figure out what's going on and what is needed. And it felt really, it just felt like very compelling work. And that was when Donald Trump got elected to his first term as a president. And I think I had been sort of naively up until that point allowing myself to believe that, the biggest problems are elsewhere, and that my energy can be best utilized working other places. And with that transition into the Trump presidency and thinking about all of these environmental justice fights we have locally in all of the communities that we are not serving today, I really shifted my focus back home. We moved to Minnesota, and I spent some time with the Nature Conservancy looking at solutions that we can apply here in our state, looking a little bit at how does environmental justice weave into all of these narratives we're building and into all of these solutions we're trying to deploy. And that led me to where I am now, really working on my own as a consultant in the climate inequity nexus, which I think is critical because we have a lot of really brilliant scientists and we have a lot of really brilliant communities. And it's really easy for us to not connect those conversations. And so trying to find a way to fold those things together to bring the right solutions to the right communities at the right time, to make sure that voices are heard. That's the space that's really been invigorating me lately.
Thanks so much, Sachiko. That's really, really interesting. And I think you should not undersell how interesting that story really is. Um, Nora, let's turn to you for a second. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, Project Optimist, and how you came to work on solutions-oriented journalism.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Nora Hertel. I am a journalist and I'm the founder of a news organization called Project Optimist that serves Greater Minnesota. We specialize in solutions journalism, which is a practice of journalism defined as rigorous and evidence-based reporting on responses to problems instead of just focusing on responses. So that's our specialty. And we do a lot of environmental reporting. We report on social issues and some business stories as well. My background, my interest in the environment goes back to elementary school. I have a journal. I used to journal a lot, which isn't surprising. And I have a journal from elementary school in which I was writing about environmental problems and how to solve them based on things I had learned in school and books I had read. And that was still an interest for me when I was in high school. There was a book called Cradle to Cradle that was really interesting to me. And there was coverage in the national news in the late 90s that was really intriguing. But it didn't become a part of my career until 2019. 2019, there was a big IPCC report that came out about the impact of 1.5 degrees of warming. I was a government reporter at the time at the St. Cloud Times in central Minnesota. And somehow that report just came into my network and the conversations happening in my professional communities. And I started to hear from other journalists and industry publications, and also from people in the St. Cloud area who are getting more involved in environmental work, who wanted to see their efforts reflected in the newspaper. So I started to integrate environmental reporting into my coverage. And then in 2021, I was selected as a fellow with MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. They had their first cohort of journalists, and I had a huge chunk of money to cover natural climate solutions in Minnesota. It was published by the St. Cloud Times, and then the stories were picked up around the U.S. That's when I met Sachi. Doing that reporting, I wrote about carbon markets and carbon sequestration in forests and in agriculture, and just really got excited at that meeting point of environmental reporting and solutions reporting. So when I left the St. Cloud Times and launched Project Optimist later in that year, 2021, I knew solutions was going to be a huge part of our focus, and environment as well. And I had heard that when I was doing my market research, that people in greater Minnesota, central Minnesota, are hungry for those kinds of stories.
Well, this is fascinating. With this kind of background and diversity of experience, I'm really excited about this conversation. And I want to start by kind of grounding us a little bit by thinking about where we're at. And, Barb, you've got this long history of working in this space on climate action. And as you know, climate change has really been on our radar screen for about that 40-year period, maybe, going back a little bit before 1993 when you got involved in that docket, but not much further than that. There's no question we have, are continuing to make gains in addressing climate change all the time. But there's also so much more that needs to be done. And I'm wondering if you could ground us and paint a picture of where we're at in our climate efforts on a state, national, and global perspective. I know it's a lot to ask of you, but I'm going to give it.
It's a lot. I'll do my best, Aaron. What I'd like to do also is sort of talk to you about another very dark time and how that turned out. And I should say, when I told my husband a while ago that I was going to be on this panel and told him the subject and the title, Light in the Dark, he laughed because apparently I haven't been in the most sunshiny of moods since Election Day. But it does help, I think, to look backwards. It certainly helps me. And so I want to take you back to another dark time around, say, 2005, because I think there are lessons that can shed some light on these dark times. 20 years ago, we were in the middle of what was then called the coal rush. And that's because after years of not building any new coal plants in the US, suddenly new coal plant proposals were popping up by the dozens around the country. And at its peak, there were over 150 new plants proposed, and each new plant represented a huge new source of greenhouse gas emissions that would last for decades. And the power sector was then already the nation's top climate polluter, thanks to its coal plants. And these new plants just meant that the sector's impact would greatly increase and US emissions would greatly increase. To be clear, this was insanity. I mean, already it was absolutely clear then that the most obvious step, if you're going to really do anything to preserve the climate, was to reduce coal dependence. And that's because coal emits more greenhouse gases than any other energy source. And nonetheless, these proposals were popping up, and it was an insanity that had the enthusiastic support of the Bush-Cheney administration. The Department of Energy was out there cheering on every new coal plant. Apparently, Dick Cheney had chaired a commission that concluded that the US needed about 200 new coal plants just to keep the lights on with growing demand. And during this coal rush, this is when I was working as a consultant and an attorney for nonprofits trying to stop it. And in that capacity, I found myself attending an industry conference in 2005. And there were, I think, about 2,000 industry folks there, and they were celebrating all these pending new coal plants and competing for the billions of dollars that were at stake. Speakers were calling this the best of times for coal generation. And I can tell you that these guys, and it was about 95% men, which was really weird even in 2005, they were almost giddy and they were extremely confident, which made sense given the undeniable political momentum and financial momentum that was driving this coal rush. Meanwhile, environmental groups were not giddy. We were feeling the opposite. We were angry and we felt overwhelmed by all these new plants, just keeping track of them. But it was such obvious insanity that it was clear that we had to fight it any way we could. So we were determined to do that, and that's what we did. But if you had to bet on the fate of the coal rush in, say, 2007 or so, it would have been reasonable to bet that our coal dependence was about to greatly expand along with our greenhouse gases. And fortunately, that is not what happened because the vast majority of those plants did not get built. And I have a few slides that I want to show you to help illustrate what happened instead. So we're going to see if we can make this work. All right, can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So if you look at these lines represent the energy greenhouse gas emissions from the different sectors of the economy, and this top line is the power sector. So you can see around 2005, this is 2005, this is 2007. Instead of emissions going up and up and up and up and up, which is what we had every reason to expect, and that was the official US government prediction, turned out it was the peak of emissions from the electric sector, and they started going down and down and down, and that has continued, pretty much ever since, though not quite linearly. Power sector emissions actually went down 41% since 2007. That allowed for economy-wide energy emissions to go down 20%. Since 2007, this might be a bit of an overstatement because there are some emissions we haven't been able to capture very well. But it's really important those power sector emissions went down because the power sector, decarbonizing the power sector is key to decarbonizing the other sectors because the best way to do that is to electrify them, to electrify transportation and industry and buildings. So this was an absolutely critical shift going from up to down. Now, I'd love to say that it was just our plucky band of environmental activists that made this happen, that we defeated the industry and the federal government. And we certainly did our part. I mean, certainly we bought time for other forces to intervene and help emissions to go down instead of up. So I want to talk a little bit now about what some of those other forces were. So this again is 2005 or so. What we're looking at here is the percentage of US electricity that we got from all of these different sources of electricity. And the top line is coal. And so this is 2005, and then you can see it going down, down, and down. And it went from over 50% of the power that we got to now only about 15%. I've actually updated these numbers a little beyond what this chart shows. Now, unfortunately, a big reason it went down was natural gas going way, way up. And that's sort of good because natural gas only emits about half as much of the CO2 as coal, but it's sort of bad because this was driven by fracking, and also there's methane leakage and other issues. So basically, our next challenge is to bend this line around. But I really want to draw your attention to this line. So around 2005, the line that represents both wind and solar rounded to 0% of US generation. And that started to slowly grow. And now it is also at about 15%. So it's roughly the same as coal right now. So how did that happen? That happened because of state policy, largely because of states like Minnesota with renewable energy standards that gave these new industries a foothold, and also policies in other countries that helped make those industries come forward. Whoops, so that was from 0 to 15%. I'm going to go back. Well, I want to, let's see, I think I can go back. There we go. Because there's some things I just want to point out here. Whoops, did that work? That didn't really work. There we go. All right, so here, if you look at what happened here in 2005, here we are at the peak, and it starts going down. You may recall that around 2008, we had that little global economic meltdown. We also then had the Obama administration elected, but Obama ran into enormous conflict and enormous opposition from Congress, from the Tea Party, from the Supreme Court. And yet, emissions from coal kept going down. And if you look at the Trump administration, you remember Trump talking about how he was going to bring back beautiful, beautiful coal. He tried very hard. He put a coal lobbyist in charge of the EPA. He rolled back EPA's greenhouse gas regulations, but coal's share of electricity kept going down, down, down. And so that's something that gives me some hope, just recognizing that there are forces at work here that are not controlled by the president, and including forces like what goes on at the state level. But a lot of the action also is happening globally. And I just wanted to stress a few points here. We apparently spend now a record amount in energy investment, in new energy investments. And right now it's up to about $3 trillion in the last year. And of that, there's twice as much being spent on clean energy as on fossil fuels, and this is the new stuff. So the clean energy, according to this report, includes renewables, storage, efficiency, grids, nuclear power, and electric vehicles. And a word about China. China burns an obscene amount of coal, and it's an enormous polluter, but it is also investing very heavily in renewable energy. In fact, it invests 4 times more in renewables than the US, at least based on the last year or so. And of course, Trump talks a lot about China, and if he ends up actually limiting how much we spend on renewables, which is, not enough, but a lot, he's going to end up actually empowering China even more to dominate these technologies of the future. But that does mean at least that these technologies are going to continue to advance. And as they advance, they get better and cheaper. And that's what gives the whole energy transition a lot of momentum. And one more stat that I want to share that I found kind of inspiring, that in terms of the new generation that is being built around the world, there is more money being spent on solar photovoltaics than on all other generation combined. So you can combine coal plants, gas plants, nuclear plants, hydro, and even wind, and solar exceeds them. So this is telling you where the industry is going, where the technology is going. And so I just find that encouraging, and in dark moments, I think it's important to look back and realize that this is still happening.
Well, that was really helpful. I mean, I think it is important to keep in mind that, we have faced dark times before. I mean, I'll point out that during that 2005, 2007 period, we had elected an oil man as president and no real concern about fossil fuels. So it is, we may be facing a similar period of time now, having just elected another climate change denier as a president.
I think that's right. And Erin, actually, if I could just say one more thing about that. One thing that Trump did manage to do really well during his time in office was to galvanize the opposition, because he's very good at infuriating people. And as a result, we saw the climate movement become stronger than ever, particularly the youth climate movement, with much more aggressive asks. And I think that is clearly why the Biden administration was more aggressive on that. And so when I think about what's going to happen in the next few years, I expect that pattern to repeat. And I think that's another something that we need to hang on to, and that can be a little light in the dark.
Yeah, understood. Well, I want to turn to Nora next, because the work that you're doing in journalism, solutions-oriented journalism, and the climate movement, is really important. And I'm curious about what you think about the role that journalism can and should play in this kind of moment where we've elected a climate change denier as a president. We've faced a lot of challenges when it comes to making progress on the policy level. But I'm wondering what you're thinking about journalism and the role that it can play in this moment.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. And I also want to say, before I talk about solutions journalism a lot, it's a really important time for accountability journalism as well, and political coverage of the administration, and just kind of keeping track of conflicts of interest and things like that are at play once the new administration takes over. And those things are important now as well, and have been. But my focus has been on solutions, and I think that's a really important focus in keeping journalism relevant lately, and engaging people who have been put off by journalism's, I would call it a negativity bias. Like, we do need to cover the problems, but sometimes people get very overwhelmed by that kind of coverage. And climate change in particular is tough for us to wrap our heads around. It's a big existential problem. It spans the entire globe. It spans decades. It's just not the way that our brains don't prefer to think about threats that are that big. We like to look at threats that are much more immediate. And I think what journalism can do to help us keep climate change front of mind is to keep it on the agenda, is to keep covering it, and to cover it in bite-sized pieces. So covering it across beats. When I started reporting on climate change, I was the government reporter, an investigative reporter at a local newspaper. And I think I give trainings now. So I train other reporters in how to do solutions journalism, and how to do basic journalism. And I tell them about climate change, that climate change is really the story of our lifetime. It is the most important thing that we will cover, and it spans every single beat. It's included in health. It has implications in education, in infrastructure. There's the social justice issues to cover, and the protests, business. It just touches every aspect of our life, and every beat that local news or national news would cover. And we hadn't been doing a good job of integrating it into regular coverage. maybe because people thought that it was too big, maybe they thought it was too politicized. But I have seen a movement in the field starting at the same time that I really woke up to the need to cover climate change myself, to encourage more coverage across the country. So in 2019, two organizations launched that I think are important to know about. One is called Covering Climate Now, and that is a coalition of news outlets. I think they actually have partners all around the world, but they're based here in the U.S. And they provide training, and they also just encourage journalists to cover climate. They partnered with the Solutions Journalism Network, which is an organization that I work with a lot, to create a blueprint for how to do more climate coverage and how to do it better for journalists who don't have a science background, who didn't study, who didn't think that they would be writing about climate change when they launched their careers. And now we see, it's impacting all of us. It's here. So that is an important organization that's keeping it in the conversation. And then there's another one called the Uproot Project, which is a group of journalists of color who are environmental journalists. And they support each other. They produce their own content. They promote each other's work. They focus a lot on environmental justice, and they emerged in 2019 as well. So that was really kind of for me, a big year of change for the networks that I'm in. I started to see climate becoming much more integrated into regular coverage. So that's kind of how we see it at the national level. I think there's still a lot of work to do. Those organizations have grown, their influence has grown, but there's still a lot of work to do. There's still a ton of stories that are not covered. So that's where Project Optimist emerged, right? We know that there's a lot of stories on climate and environment in Greater Minnesota that weren't being covered by existing news organizations. And some of that is because climate change just really hasn't been top of mind, or we think that our audience doesn't want to hear about it or can't handle it. But what I have found is that there really is a hunger for it if we can approach it in a palatable way. And so approaching it across beats, that's part of that. And we also need to approach it with the solutions lens, because, when we're worried about when we're dealing with existential dread as well, it's too much really for us to swallow. So to break it down, and then also to focus on how are people responding. So I like to use the paraphrase of Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, who, this is not a direct quote, but he said something like, look for the helpers. And that for me is that's really it's really the only reason why I stayed in journalism, because I found a way to focus my reporting around the helpers. And we're not lifting them up as heroes. We're looking at what they're doing and interrogating those solutions to see what works. And solutions journalism is not, it's not like a silver bullet. We don't cover a solution and say, all right, we figured it out. They solved climate change. But because the problem is so big, there's so many people taking bites out of it. And it's important to interrogate those solutions, like carbon markets, for example, it's really exciting to think about how the ag sector could decrease their carbon footprint by sequestering carbon in the soil. But it's really hard to measure soil carbon. So while that's a great story and there's a lot of information there, it's also important for people to understand that solution can work to this extent, Or maybe it's not the best climate solution, but it's also helpful for ecosystem services and that kind of thing. So there really needs to be journalism around this work so that people in communities whose taxes are paying for that kind of work, or who are making purchasing choices that impact which businesses are able to experiment or implement that kind of innovation. So journalism is really important in that way, even though it's kind of a rough time for journalism right now.
Yeah, I mean, and we could probably spend another hour talking about that alone, to be honest.
Right,
And
right.
the issue, of course, is just having a vibrant local journalism infrastructure that can tell these stories. But it's really exciting to hear more about how you're approaching that and how that relates to the work of, buttressing climate action. I do want to turn to Sachiko and ask a little bit about her work too, particularly in your work that intersects with social justice. You talked about that in your introduction. Um, Throughout history, social change movements like the climate movement have faced with at time felt like insurmountable odds and then really slow progress and made progress in the face of all of that. What can those in the climate movement glean from those examples, and how do you think about the movement to force climate action as part of the solution, not just about policy, but just about that movement and how people come together around that issue?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I think that's a really good question, and one that we need to keep asking ourselves, honestly. I think a couple of really big takeaways from other movements come to mind for me. The first one is just that um, we're here to talk about climate hope because I suspect all of us sometimes feel like it can be hopeless. And I think the first note for me is that we have seen these types of situations before. We have seen movements seeking social change that have at some point in history looked hopeless or felt impossible or felt like something that was completely unachievable within a person's lifetime. And we have still made those changes. We have progressed on human rights. We have progressed on racial equality. We have made changes in how we manage and govern ourselves. And so I think one inspiration that I use a lot is the original Green New Deal proposal and the future casting that it involved. It was really, I think, a really smart effort to say, let's take away the barriers. Let's take away the I can't, we can't, we'll never. And let's think about what kind of world we want to live in and what we think could be possible given the technologies that we have available today. And then let's kind of put that as our guiding star and think about what is a path that we believe can get us there. So I think just to begin with, we have to know that it's possible for us to make change and for us to address climate change in a way that is going to be equitable and sustainable. I think there are also a lot of best practices from former social change movements that we can draw inspiration from, thinking about, the need to center the most vulnerable. So a lot of climate advocates today are not just thinking about climate action and mitigating carbon dioxide emissions, but we're also thinking about climate equity and climate justice. What does it mean to be a community that is based on the coast that is going to be, exposed to a lot more flooding and different types of storms? What does it mean to kind of center those communities and those individuals who will be the most impacted? We also see, I think, a lot of success with grassroots organizing and with strong personal narratives to build public support for change. And I think, again, the Green New Deal or some of these actions have created those narratives. There are a lot of youth climate movements today that are creating those narratives, talking about this is what climate change means to me as a young person and means for my future, and here's how it's impacting me. And I think finally, a last kind of general best practice from other movements that I think about is the ability to really strive to include diverse voices. And that means not just picking the usual suspects and inviting the same elected official to talk about the topic time and time again, but, accepting voices like Greta Thunberg. I always say her last name wrong. I'm sorry. But let's encourage those people who have interesting stories and strong narratives to speak up and to share with the rest of us so that we can all draw that inspiration from each other. And then I think a lot about global nonviolent protests because we're really in this weird situation, right? Where we're not talking about a war, we're not talking about a major conflict, but we're talking about that magnitude of change or more when we think about restructuring our society to really be resilient and climate friendly and environmentally friendly. And one of the big takeaways from some research on a nonviolent protest is called the 3.5% rule. If you can activate 3.5% of a population, that is sufficient to drive major political change. And this comes out of research from Harvard by Erica Chenoweth, whose name I wrote down because I couldn't remember it. She did a ton of research on this topic, and every time a political movement got to 3.5% of activation, so people showing up to strikes, kids walking out on strike for Fridays for the Future, every time they got to 3.5%, the movement succeeded. And I think to me, that's really important because we see that we are in a society where not everyone prioritizes climate action. And we see that we're in a society where we are very divided and we have these sort of existential threats looming over us. And it's really hard to think about how could we ever get to consensus on something like that. And so I think to me, looking at these other movements and saying, actually, it doesn't take consensus. It takes 3% of people to be very activated and willing to jump in the deep end of the pool and to try to push for those big changes. 3.5% of Minnesota, just for context, is like Duluth and Rochester. You don't need anybody from the city. You don't need anybody from the rest of the state. Like if you just take the citizens of Duluth and Rochester, that's 3.5%. So we're talking about something that really actually feels achievable when you start to think about activating single-digit percents of people towards this issue. And I think, getting to kind of what Barb was discussing and Aaron, something you mentioned, it really points to the need for political change. I saw a question in the Q&A about not just offering palliative care and not just giving ourselves a pass to not take individual action. Yes, individual action does matter to some extent, but individual action isn't how we're going to change the world and isn't how we're going to solve the climate crisis. We really need structural change, and that means that we need to be influencing policy, public policy, federal policy, state policy, governance of organizations and decision-making, governance of corporations and regulations and how we kind of track these things. Aaron, I don't know if you have anything more to say there, but I think one thing that we can kind of draw from where we are in history is that we can't only be thinking at the individual level. We have to be thinking at this really holistic structural level in order to get to the magnitude of solutions that we're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, you're obviously right about that. And I think, it's interesting the example you brought up about the Green New Deal. And I remember the moment that this was first proposed, people may recall that at the moment that it was proposed, it was like very popular. All of a sudden it was like, oh my gosh, we got this polling data that shows that most people are like really supportive of this. And it became a policy issue, and it was then brought into kind of the meat grinder of how policy is treated, right? But the part that you pointed out that I think is really important to stress is that it wasn't just a policy. This was also a change in the narrative, and it brought in new voices to the movement, and that legacy of that moment continues, and it really is still fueling climate action, even though whatever that policy looked like at the time it was proposed has largely been lost to the dustbin of history, right? And it goes to show how important the movement generating and movement building aspect of that moment was, even if the policy never got adopted in the first place. I want to turn to one more question that I think, is really, this is for all the panelists, and I think it really is kind of a lot of folks are grappling with right now is this sense of climate anxiety, like this stress and fear that people are starting to feel. I mean, we've felt for a long time about the state of the climate crisis and what's yet to come, both in terms of what the climate is likely to become, but also the frustration we're likely to encounter in trying to generate action. And then there's also this idea of climate grief, right? The idea that, people are mourning what we've lost already and what we're likely to lose. And I mean, I think about that in terms of when I go to the Boundary Waters, I think about what would it be like if there weren't moons here, or the forest was different. So if people are already thinking, they're kind of future casting what the world might be like, and it's not a very optimistic picture, quite honestly. So I'm wondering, like, how do you experience climate grief, and how does it come up for you, and what do you do when it does? And what relationship do you see between climate grief and climate anxiety and the need for taking action and to build a movement? And I just open that to anybody. If I don't know, Sachi, if you want to start with that, that'd be great. If anyone else wants to jump in, we'd love to hear all of you talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have so many feelings about this topic. Um, the first little factoid I want to just share is that I saw the Yale Program on Climate Communications just put out an article on climate, I think they called it climate distress,
Yeah, I saw
and
that
that
too.
10 to 20% of Americans are already feeling and experiencing climate distress, and that number is just going to go up, right? So I just want to start with this kind of grounding that this is something that impacts a lot of us already and is going to keep growing. Um, I think that in order to be hopeful and in order to hope that we can solve the climate crisis and create a sustainable future for ourselves and our children and the rest of the world, I think that we have to have grief because if we're going to hold out hope for the type of change we want to see, it's not always going to be realized. We build up our hope every time we think about a new policy to change our ambitions when it comes to clean energy. We build up hope every time something like a Green New Deal is proposed. We build up hope every time we talk about shutting down a polluting facility that's impacting local residents. And as much as we all want to, we don't win all of those fights. And I think it's necessary for us to grieve those losses in order to keep going and in order to be able to access hope the next time around. Like we have to recognize that there are real losses there. Um, I keep looking down at my notebook where my notes for today's talk are because today is actually my first day back to work after I took a mental health break after the election. I had some personal stuff going on too, but I just needed some space to be able to kind of process where we are and what's happening in our world and to think about what does this mean for my career in climate change? What does this mean for the future that I wanted to see happening in the 2020s, right? Um, it's very different from what I would have sketched out if I got to make all of the decisions. And so I do really believe in the need to hold that grief. And I think that there are some really good resources available for doing that. Um, I think, I mean, I have utilized kind of personal spaces for that in the past when I've worked in toxic work environments or places where there was a lot of just tightness about equity and how do we do this and how do we do big enough and how do we do it local enough and how do we, I had a weekly space with some friends to honor the challenge, to create space just to talk and to air the problems that we're seeing and to receive support from people who are also struggling with that kind of thing. And there are formal places for that too. I know Josna Harris and Ben Weaver, who are two of my very favorite Minnesota climate activists, regularly hold kind of climate grief spaces. They've had some at Bryant Lake Bowl in Minneapolis, and I know they've had some elsewhere, just trying to create opportunities for anyone to show up and process together. And I also know this is certainly not the only one, but there is a community called One Resilient Earth that also offers a virtual opportunity for that, especially for people who are engaging with climate and environmental issues day to day. So yeah, I absolutely think that we need more of those and that we need to utilize them in order to keep having hope and in order to keep pushing for the changes that we want to see.
Yeah, no, and I saw that same poll that you mentioned from the Yale program on climate change, and I think the fun part for me was the other part of it, which was that folks who are experiencing climate distress were more likely to take action than
Yep.
folks who were not, and I thought that's an important thing to stress as well.
And if you think we have 16% of Americans who are likely to take action because they're experiencing climate distress, let me just point out that 16 is bigger than 3.5. And so if we're thinking about activating folks and finding reasons to show up for this topic, we're well on our way to having a movement that can really create some high magnitude of impact.
Yeah. Nora, do you have some thoughts about this climate anxiety and climate grief and how it relates to either your work or how climate action might proceed in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so my organization is called Project Optimist. We try to focus on productive, constructive, positive things for people as an antidote to the bad news out there. But sometimes it's hard for me to be to show up in that way, in that headspace. So I spend a lot of effort taking care of my own mental health, in kind of all the typical ways you hear: exercise, sleep, therapy, etc. And I tried to do the same for my staff and encourage taking care of your mental health, because it's just as important as taking care of your physical health. And we're going to see more of that as well. When you think about disasters fueled by climate change, those impact people's mental health as well as their physical circumstances. So we just need to be aware that mental health is a part of this challenge, in our personal level, and kind of at a higher scale. Also, I would say two things that are particular to climate that I rely on a lot is I have started talking about it, my grief, with friends who we never talked about science or the environment with, and have found that they feel the same, that it has impacted their lives in different ways. One of my friends provides healthcare on the streets of New York City and won't be able to do that as it gets hotter. Another friend lives on an island that's been battered by hurricanes. Another friend taps her maple trees and had a terrible crop of maple syrup last year because of the way that it froze and thawed and froze. So those are sad stories, but somehow hearing it from them and commiserating together has been really helpful for me. Also, most importantly, spending time outside. That is something that people value despite their political background. It's something that for me is almost immediately restorative. We did a series called Biophilia, which had a lot to do with art and the environment. And we are nature. We are part of nature. We have separated ourselves by spending time inside our homes, but it is so easy to reconnect with the natural world. And I feel like that is important in one way because it's restorative, and it's also very important because it reminds us what we are fighting for.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a really great place for us to kind of move to conclude this conversation, which has been fantastic. And because I think one of the things we're all looking for is what can we do? I mean, like to kind of keep that hope going. What can we do in our own personal lives and our own personal practices to try to keep that work happening? And I'm wondering if I could just ask everyone to kind of conclude with a little lightning round of what do you do? I mean, I mean, we've heard a little bit from you, Nora, about getting outside. I'm wondering, Barbie, what do you think? I mean, what do you do that gives you hope in your work or helps to motivate you when things feel tough when it comes to climate work?
Well, a few things. One is I unplug for a while, then come back in. Another is I try to take a kind of historic perspective, which, requires you to sort of look for the good parts of history and not focus so much on the bad parts, but at least reminds you that, in fact, change can happen, and it can happen very quickly, more quickly than you might expect. And I also I want to echo what Sachiko and Nora have said about the importance of coming together and working together, because that's the answer, whether you're talking about how do we make change or how do we keep our own souls thriving in this context. It is by coming together, and that can solve both of these issues.
Yeah. Sachiko, what do you think? I mean, what gives you hope in this work or helps to keep you motivated when things get tough?
I think the biggest thing for me is having that sense of community that I mean, Nora, you were even alluding to talking about climate with other people and finding that they're experiencing similar things. I really appreciate opportunities to lean into local efforts that impact my community and my neighborhood. So thinking about small projects in Minneapolis that maybe are never going to change the world, but they're going to change lives for a couple of people, and they're at a scale that I actually can develop that hope that we can make a difference.
Yeah, and scale really matters too. I mean, especially in this particular issue, because it can feel so overwhelming and so huge. And to break it into small pieces and try to make progress does really feel like it can help you understand most of all why you do the work, but also what the meaning of the work is for individual people. Nora, you talked a little bit about in your last answer about like, getting outside and stuff. I'm wondering if you have things to add about how you stay optimistic or how you stay motivated doing this work, even when it gets tough.
I would add that I select my reading around stories that have some kind of hope or solution. We had exchanged some books that were really helpful, usually nonfiction, but there's The Ministry for the Future that is a fiction story that's amazing. And also, there's a lot of books out there that provide ideas on local actions like Heidi Roop's Climate Handbook and Climate Action Handbook. And then Catherine Hayhoe has a great book called Saving Us about how to talk about climate change. All We Can Save is this amazing collection of poetry and essays, and there's art in there. And it just those stories, writing, that kind of creative expression and creative thinking is really helpful to me.
Yeah. I mean, since we're talking about books, I'll throw out another one that I really love. It's called Finding Beauty in a Broken World by Terry Tempest Williams. It's about 2008. And it's what I love about that book. It kind of is this meditation and dialogue between the art of making art out of broken things. And I love the idea that, part of our fuel for our soul, so to speak, is really about how do we engage in art and how do we engage in creative meaning making, not just about how we make policy. Also, by the way, all the resources you've been seeing kind of skim down your screen throughout this process in the chat box. We will put them together into a kind of resource email at the end. So if you've registered for the webinar, you're going to get a whole bunch of these links. If you missed anything or you don't want to, you thought you might have missed something above, don't worry about it. You're going to get an email soon with both a recording of this webinar, but also a lot of the links that were provided in the chat throughout the whole webinar. We're getting close to 1 o'clock, and I apologize. I know that a lot of folks had very thoughtful questions in the Q&A. I know that some of the panelists, including Sachiko, thank you so much for engaging with some of those questions. We'll do our best to try to address those in future webinars, but we just don't have time today, unfortunately. So we're going to have to move on from that. But I wanted to start by thanking everybody, especially the panelists. Thank you so much. You guys have done amazing work, and not only that, provided some hope, I think, in a dark time, and that's what we're really here to do. So thank you so much to Barb, Sachiko, and Nora. Thank you very much. Also, just as a matter of concluding, I also want to thank the over 200 people. I mean, that's a huge number of people who joined us today. And, I think it really goes to show that this work is both essential, but also that we're all kind of thinking about the same thing right now. We're trying to grapple with this idea of how we would create hope in dark times, and how we can support one another in this essential work. And so thank you for being here today. It's really important that we continue this conversation, both online, but also in our real lives. And I hope that you're leaving today a little bit more hopeful or inspired about, not only about like what's possible with policy, but also what's possible in terms of building meaning with our friends and neighbors in this work. And again, as I mentioned earlier, please consider making a donation to MCEA by clicking on the link in the chat. Webinars like this one and the work we do at MCEA are only possible because of you and your individual support. So continue donating today so we can finish our year and move into 2025 well-resourced to continue the fight for climate action and a livable climate for everybody who follows us on this earth. So thank you again. Look out for our email. We really appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us. And I would again like to thank Barb, Sachiko, and Nora for their really thoughtful and interesting responses. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. See you soon.
Bye-bye.